it is an inconvenience to the industry as a whole. And that's because what usually happens is they try to apply one-size-fits-all interpretations and understandings to nuanced things. So if Ethereum staking, for example, in its current model with the majority of its actors is a regulated activity, they may just decide that all staking is a regulated activity and say, well, fuck you. So I don't think there's any issue with Cardano as it sits. I don't think there's any issue with our staking model as it sits. Unfortunately, conflation of what Ethereum is doing with Cardano may drag us in an uncomfortable direction. Undoubtedly, many of you have seen the CoinDesk article that came out today, probably about an hour or so ago, that said, hey, Kraken and the SEC are about to settle over some concerns the SEC had about staking that they offer on their platform. Also, Brian Armstrong tweeted yesterday that the SEC is looking aggressively into staking services, and no doubt they probably had some informal or formal communications through private channels. So it prompted me to reply to that tweet because someone asked me to, that I said Ethereum staking is somewhat problematic. We have this issue where there is no canonical definition of what delegation, staking, liquidity, custodianship really means. So Avalanche and Polkadot and Tezos and Cardano and Ethereum and Algorand, and even though these are all staking systems, they actually have very different modes of operation. And the problem is that in those nuances actually really do translate to regulatory overhead. So one of the first challenges from a regulatory perspective is if you have an asset and you have to transfer that asset to another party for them then to do something on your behalf to generate a return, in some jurisdictions and some interpretations, that actor doing that may be a regulated actor. Why? Because they have a custodial risk and potential information asymmetries, and also your returns are 100% based upon their efforts and their efforts alone. This is where the rub kind of comes in. When you compare that with a Bitcoin model of Bitcoin mining pools or a Cardano model with a Cardano stake pool, the custody of the underlying asset, in the case of Bitcoin, it's your hash resources, so your actual work payload. Case of Cardano, it's the synthetic resources. They still belong to you. And what you've done is you've delegated it to them, and now you're collectively working together, you and others, to perform an action, to build a block. And only if that work is done are you guaranteed a return. But both of these are technically proof of stake. And the matter gets further conflated and contaminated when you also look at the fact that a lot of these staking services, they go beyond staking and potentially put it into some sort of DeFi play to augment a yield, which means that perhaps there's a risk there. Or in some cases, to give you liquidity, they issue a synthetic asset and say, here's this thing and it has redemption rights. There's all kinds of variations here, especially if there's a bonding component and there's an opportunity cost to losing access to those funds. It looks like the SEC is converging to a point where perhaps, at the very least, that exchanges doing this on your behalf is problematic. It is an inconvenience to the industry as a whole. And that's because what usually happens is they try to apply one-size-fits-all interpretations and understandings to nuanced things. So if Ethereum staking, for example, in its current model with the majority of its actors is a regulated activity, they may just decide that all staking is a regulated activity and say, well, fuck you, litigate it in court, and we'll figure it out. So if you're a stake pool operator and you may become regulated, or there's a pseudo-regulation, there's layers to that. With the infrastructure bill that was passed in the United States, there's this unenforced statutory mandate about this concept of collection of information about the people that you have a business relationship with. So it was a stupid thing. Toomey and others really tried hard to remove it from the bill, and unfortunately, politics got in the way, and it passed with a very bad provision. it is an interesting question about starting to change staking models to accommodate regulatory nuances. So on the Cardano side, one of the discussions we've had for a while, and we just haven't had the time to write this up, but we'd like to do this maybe as a work product of the MBO, is writing a SIP to introduce a concept of a new stake pool certificate. Well, you can introduce a concept of contingent staking, and basically it's two-sided multisig. So how that would work is that if Alice wants to delegate to Bob's pool, Alice would send a transaction, it would be pending, and Bob, the stake pool operator, also has to sign that before they can broadcast that transaction as a legitimate delegation. Now, the idea is that there'd be a metadata payload, and Alice would provide some information to Bob, like a DID or something, for Bob to then feel comfortable. And then Bob would actually have records about Alice. Now, this is not just for regulatory purposes. Many of you in the Cardano ecosystem get involved in things called ISPOs. And there's usually some sort of promise where they say, delegate to my pool, I keep the ADA revenue for a while, and then I'm going to keep a ledger and track what your return should have been, and then give you tokens in another project. Great. But then you'll notice a lot of these guys say, I'm sorry, we can't do this for US citizens for a variety of reasons. Okay, so they blacklist the United States, and a lot of people do that. Well, how they tend to reconcile is that when you go to redeem the tokens, they say, all right, prove who you are. But you've already given them the money. You've already given them the, your stake pool rewards. So with contingent settlement, what you would do is before any business relationship is established, you would generally have an exchanging of information. In this particular case, it wouldn't just be a KYC point to verify that you're not a US citizen. You'd probably have them sign a contract, some form of distribution agreement as well. Now, as a regulated entity, let's say they just say stake pools are now regulated. The interesting thing would be, could you operate where you syndicate the license of an actor? So for example, maybe an RIA or whatever the regulatory structure may be, maybe they can provide basically a white label where you can be the operator of the pool, run the pool, but you're running under the license of that operator, and other stake pools are as well, or you can become a direct regulated entity. If regulation goes in an uncomfortable and wrong way for our industry, this might end up having to be the way that people run stake pools in the United States. Or they could use contingent staking to blacklist US delegations. So you have a regulated and unregulated set. Welcome to really bad regulation. This is the route that we're going down, and until Congress passes a law basically reining in very unreasonable agencies, we're probably going to be dealing with this for the next 12 to 24 months. Any complaint about the Ethereum custodial staking model is transitive to the Cardano liquid non-staking model. And it's certainly something that should be litigated if somebody asserts that, because I think it's completely wrong and there's no facts and circumstances to equivocate the two. I think we fall under the same work package model as Bitcoin mining pools, which have been in operation for almost 13 years in our industry without incident or complaint. But obviously there's going to be a national discussion now about these things, especially now that Kraken and others are getting involved. You'll probably see a lot of FUD over Twitter, Reddit, and other places saying, oh, well, if staking is a security, that must mean the underlying asset is. So Ether is now a security, or ADA is now a security. Let's be very clear. Again, governments are unpredictable. Facts and circumstances could change, and we see things the same time you guys do. So we'll cross that bridge if it comes. But as it stands right now, the ecosystem is fine. So I don't think there's any issue with Cardano as it sits. I don't think there's any issue with our staking model as it sits. Unfortunately, conflation of what Ethereum is doing with Cardano may drag us in an uncomfortable direction, and we as an industry have to work on these nuances and details. The good news is that there's plenty of other ecosystems that have more sensible consensus models, and as a result would likely litigate and fight bad things. And obviously exchanges and other operators are going to have to figure out how to operate. On our side, we could do things proactively, like using Avtala Prism and DIDs and contingent staking. If we want to scale up as an industry, as an ecosystem, the regulatory side. And obviously there's all kinds of arcane legal structures that could be put together to syndicate regulatory oversight if and when that comes to the staking pool model. If you're an SPO right now, it is not a regulated business, the best of our understanding. But again, things can change. Maybe all this goes away with the US government changing from one political party to another, and they're more reasonable than the current one about the status of cryptocurrencies in the United States. Or maybe a law is passed that creates statutory clarity about where and when and what we're supposed to do. Like FIA had this concept of an auxiliary asset, for example. Until then, we're still living in the regulation by enforcement paradigm. And until then, we're still living in the we'll let you know and best of luck situation, which is the absolute worst way of running an economy. It's the absolute worst way of conducting business. It's ultimately counterproductive and destructive. And all it does is convince people to offshore and blacklist the United States, which is happening en masse now. It's not to say there aren't bad actors. Every industry has them. FTX is the pinnacle of that for our industry, but it's just one of many that we've dealt with for almost 14 years now, whether it be Silk Road or Mt. Gox or BitConnect or OneCoin. These things do happen. And oftentimes they have the exact same structure, which is, wasn't the crypto, it wasn't a failure of a protocol, it was a centralized actor saying, trust us. You trusted them, and then they screwed you. By the way, custodial staking does suffer from this problem. If you give your funds to somebody else to do something with them, they can screw you too. That's why regulation exists. Regulation comes into play when these problems are there. I will remind everybody, the only way we're ever going to get out of this was a satisfactory outcome, meaning that we have our liberty and we can operate and build great things and go chase the future, is if we come together and treat each other with civility. It is perfectly reasonable to point out that protocol design choices people have made may inadvertently create problems in a regulatory viewpoint. That's just a fact, and that's where we're at, and it's creating a systemic problem for the industry.